thank you so much to everyone for coming. Thank you to Beth and the library for hosting us. And especially thank you to our speaker, David Detmold. My name is Chantel Kimball, and I'm a member of the admin team for Grafton Rise. Grafton Rise was formed in the spring of 2020 in the wake of the brutal murder of George Floyd. And we were formed with the goal of providing education and action, small and large, in order to help create a more inclusive and respectful community. To that end, we have partnered with Change the Mass Flag in order to bring Article 34, a resolution to support changing the state seal and state flag, to town meeting on May 8th. We are very excited to welcome David Detmold to speak to us regarding the efforts to date, the history of the current seal and flag, how this continues to cause harm to the Indigenous peoples living here today, and why it is so important to make this change. David is the coordinator of the ChangeTheMassFlag.com website. In that role, he has worked with more than 60 towns and cities over the last 5 years to bring resolutions of support for changing the flag and seal of Massachusetts to their annual town meetings and city council votes. We have won 59 out of 61 of those votes so far. He was an elected member of the Montague Town Meeting for 20 years and is the founding editor of the independent weekly newspaper, the Montague Reporter. So thank you again for coming, and I welcome David Detmold to take over.
Okay, and thank you very much for that very wonderful introduction, and thank you for coming out tonight on such a beautiful spring evening to talk just for a little while about our state symbol, the flag of Massachusetts, which is based on the seal of Massachusetts. That's not the case in every of the 50 states, but here in Massachusetts, whatever the seal has been, that's our flag. And I want to go back in history a little bit because the history of this seal and flag is quite old here in one of the original colonies, and we go right back to when the Puritans came over in 1629, and they brought this image with them. I'm sorry, they came in 1630, but a year before they sailed over, there are 30 ships sailing into what was then called Shawmut Bay, now called Boston Harbor. But the year before they sailed, they came up with a seal for their commercial enterprise called the Massachusetts Bay Company, chartered by the King of England to actually create a settlement here, but also to bring resources from the new colony back to England and to make money for the stockholders. It was a commercial venture and a successful one from that standpoint. Along the shores, of course, were the great fishing grounds that gave Cape Cod its name, and mariners from Europe had been sailing over here for nearly a century prior to the settlement of Boston. But also the white pine was a huge attraction. Massachusetts as a colony used to include Maine for a long time, as some of you may know. And England at that time was a burgeoning maritime empire, needed the kind of timber that was available here, easily brought down the rivers to the shore. And so this was, from the stockholders' point of view, this was an attempt to really look at this as a resource-rich environment with native people already living here, but with some history already of European colonial enterprises pretty much not pushing the native people aside at first, but there was the so-called doctrine of discovery, which said that if Christian explorers from Europe came to lands where Christianity was not the religion of the people, basically, that it could be claimed as the right of the explorers or the settlers, if you will, to take that land. This doctrine of discovery was just repudiated by the Vatican last month, but had been in force, or at least in theory, had been relied upon, even by our Supreme Court, in many decisions, even up until, I mean, Ruth Bader Ginsburg cited it just about 17 years ago in a land case that the Oneida brought, and it was turned down. And the doctrine of discovery is not just a historical relic, even though the Vatican has finally said that has nothing to do with our church teaching, and the Supreme Court should stop referring to it. They actually did say that. But all of which is to say that when the Puritans came over here, they brought this image with them. They were chartered by the king, and this was the seal of their company. And I want you to take a good look at it because it really is the origins of the flag that we're living with today, which when we get to that, you will see there is still this very central figure of an indigenous person. This is from the Europeans' imagination of what an indigenous person might look like, what an indigenous person might wear, although this is considered extremely offensive by the indigenous people that I've talked to about it in recent years, and I'm sure it was considered offensive at the time because nobody ever wore a loincloth of leaves like that. That's a ridiculous garment. And there's some other interesting features here, and one is that this indigenous person, again, this was the year before the Puritans had sailed, so they're over in Europe creating this image before they've even arrived, is holding one downward pointed arrow and a bow, but not a quiver of arrows on his shoulder. And were there to be a quiver full of arrows, you might consider this to be a native person who's ready to do battle in some respect. But even on the Secretary of State's website, this symbol of the one downward arrow with no quiver of arrows is considered to be a symbol of a peaceful native person, or as I like to say, a pacified native person from a European perspective. And here is this very amazing in some respects, but very offensive too, I think, speech balloon coming out of the native person's mouth saying, "Come over and help us." And if you've done even a cursory study of the relations between colonial settlers here in Massachusetts or anywhere along the East Coast, or indeed anywhere across the continent, it was hardly a relationship that might be considered beneficent to the native people in hindsight, helping them. I'm not so sure anybody could make a credible case. Perhaps this was a reference, a biblical reference, and might have been interpreted at the time as an indication that this commercial enterprise, the Puritans, were really coming over with the intention of converting indigenous people who had their own religion and belief system for thousands and thousands of years, but there was a sense from the European point of view that here's the true religion, and we're going to come over and help them to convert to it. But when you study the history of the colony, the Boston-based Massachusetts Bay Company, there were no real attempts to send missionaries toward the native communities at that time. For about 17 years after they arrived was the first attempt to really try to reach out to native people in Martha's Vineyard at that time, which was, I think, called Nope, N-O-P-E in the native tongue. That was not the original impulse, let's just say that. It's fair to say this was a commercial effort on the part of the Puritans to take land and exploit the resources, which were very rich and plentiful. So come over and help us. I think it's good to kind of like keep that in perspective, that was part of the original seal. It is no longer part of the seal, but it is this seal is the origin of what we're living with and have been living with for some hundreds of years, really. And this just, a seal was and is an object that verifies an invoice or a bill of lading by actually stamping onto a piece of parchment in the old days or a piece of paper nowadays. A metal seal has a profile, a raised profile, and it actually presses into the paper and results in a raised sort of like circular surface that you can look at that and say, oh, this is absolutely not a forgery, not a fake. This was the stamp of the colonial governor sometimes. Let's take a look at the next slide and we'll see one of those. So a little bit after the huge conflagration of war that we call King Philip's War in 1675, 1676, let's just say Native people finally at that time had felt like they had been pushed to the limit of their tolerance for the colonists who they had at first welcomed in 1620 when the Pilgrims first arrived. About 100 of them came, and in that first winter, about half of them starved. They didn't bring enough provisions with them. They landed, as you might know, in what is now considered Plymouth, but at that time was called Patuxent. And it was a native village that had been massively depopulated by a viral plague that makes what we've just gone through here in the last 2 or 3 years look mild in comparison. Passing ship captains would look at the depopulated villages along the shore and say there were not enough living left to bury the dead. And historians have estimated that the mortality rate was it smallpox? We're not really sure, but it was some European disease that nobody here at that time had any resistance to. And Patuxent was a rich, cornfield-rich farming area prior to this viral outbreak that had happened just about a year before the Pilgrims sailed over. And it was pretty much, that population was decimated. And so when the Wampanoag came to them in that winter, we talk about Massasoit as if that was the name of their chieftain, but actually that is the word for sachem or chieftain in their language, and his name was Usamiquin, and he came to their rescue really and helped them get through that first winter of terrible starvation. And about 50 of them survived. About half the original Pilgrims came through that first winter thanks to the Wampanoag. So there was a sense that there were peaceful relations to begin with. There was a sense of mutual need. The Wampanoags, as I say, had been, their population had really taken a huge hit from this introduction of European diseases, and they felt like maybe there could be an alliance that would be mutually beneficial. So there was a treaty of sorts, and the Wampanoag feel like they kept it on their end for quite some time. But about 3 years after the Pilgrims arrived, Miles Standish, who was the military commander of the Pilgrim colony, called a conference or a parley with Massachusetts tribal leaders. The Massachusetts tribal nation was more centered around what we call Boston today. Wampanoag were more south from there and right on in towards Rhode Island, where they bordered the Narragansett territory. And here, of course, we're living in the Nipmuc land, which stretched from what we consider Natick today to the Connecticut River, to the New Hampshire border, and down beyond Rhode Island and Connecticut. So there were many tribal nations, but the Wampanoag were actually the first to really reach out to the colonial settlers and bring them help. But Miles Standish, as I was saying, called a conference with some of the Massachusetts leaders, and this is in the history books, I'm sad to say, and ambushed and killed them and cut off one of their heads and brought it back to Plymouth and mounted it on a stake. And so that is remembered as part of the history, particularly from the Massachusetts people's point of view. So what I was going to say was all of this led to, there was a sense that they were losing their lands incrementally to a system that was alien to them of deeds and courthouses. I think it is fair to say, although I don't know if anyone in the room is Indigenous who might be more authoritatively ready to speak on this subject than I, but I've talked and had the honor to be around Native people for most of my life, and I don't think that land was considered commonly as a resource to be held in private and profited from by any particular individual or family, but tribal nations cared for and kept the land in common, and it was a common resource that they cared for the generations to come, not a resource to be exploited for personal or private gain. So the sense that suddenly many of their traditional homelands were being encroached upon by documents in a foreign tongue that claimed them for private property for families who just a few decades earlier they had been, reaching out and seeking help from the Wampanoag and from the other native nations. So there was conflict brewing, and finally it led to this huge outbreak of war that was really the most terrible loss of life from America's point of view of any war that America has ever gone through, per capita. King Philip's War or Metacom's War. Metacom was the second son of Usamiquin, the Massasoit who I mentioned. His elder brother died under mysterious circumstances after visiting Plymouth. The Wampanoag felt like perhaps he had been poisoned, they just didn't know. And the leadership of that tribe fell to his younger brother, Metacom. And the English personified him as the leader of this outbreak and rebellion, but he was more of a diplomat between tribal nations. And so he came to the Nipmuc, and for example, their great woman warrior leader named Wetamu fielded far more protectors or soldiers or warriors, whatever you might call them, in battle during 1675, 1676 than King Philip did. King Philip went from tribe to tribe trying to bring people together to say, we have had enough. We have had enough taken from us. And so this was 10 years later. That conflict did not really end in 1676. It continued, particularly in what we can now consider Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont. It continued for generations. But here in Massachusetts, the colonials, of course, were successful in putting down that effort on the native people's part to protect their lands, let's say. And about 10 years later, their Boston merchants are now trading with West Indies on their own without really bringing goods directly back to England, and they're making money that the Crown felt like, we should have our share of that. And so that's a very simplistic way of saying the charter was revoked for the Massachusetts Bay Company about 10 years after the King Philip's War. And Massachusetts, two different colonial entities. There was the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and there was the the Plymouth colony. They were folded together with Rhode Island, Connecticut, and even New York into something called the Dominion of New England, and ruled directly by the crown through his royal governor, whose name was Andros, who levied taxes against the colonists, and the colonists didn't like that because they had no say in it. And actually the Revolutionary War was largely based upon that, a century later, but at this time, which was 1686 roughly, the little town of Ipswich led a bit of a minor rebellion against Governor Andros and the system of taxation that he imposed upon them. And so Governor Andros was very, very unpopular. But I just want to show you that this seal represented what is now Massachusetts at that time. And once again, you see this sort of Eurocentric view of how a native person might be kneeling and peacefully offering the fruits of their harvest to their liege lord, when at this time, 10 years after the war, native families had been broken up and indigenous people were being sold by the boatload into slavery in West Africa, in Spain, in Bahamas, and particularly in the West Indies, where the most fearful destination for these slave ships, which were money-making enterprises on the part of the merchants in Boston and Providence and my hometown of New London, Connecticut, and other places, was Barbados, where a lot of people were put into, as enslaved people were put into labor, hard labor, in the mills that were producing, from sugarcane that were producing rum. And the mortality rate in those places, those plantations, those sugar plantations, was about 25% a year. So families were being broken up. Native people were held as slaves even as early as when Governor John Winthrop came and declared this his shining city on the hill, Boston. He had 3 Pequot slaves in his own personal household. We think of slavery mostly in terms of African American, black slaves being brought from Africa, and the terrible loss of life in the Middle Passage and the horrors that they endured. But we don't often, at the same time, realize that particularly in the northeastern states, there was a huge outflow of indigenous slaves who, for practical reasons, it was felt that if you tried to keep large numbers of indigenous people enslaved next to their home communities, they would tend to leave at the very first opportunity and get back to their people. So they were shipped overseas at the same time as boats would come over from Africa. Indigenous people, enslaved people, particularly after King Philip's War, were shipped out from these important ports and harbors that I just mentioned. Providence in particular, Boston and New London were 3 of them. New Bedford, another. Also, it was legal at that time for whaling captains to come and take native children as young as 10 years old or younger and put them on whaling vessels outward bound for 4 years, just take them away from their families. Native people at that time, not kneeling as happy subjects at all, but in fact were considered wards of the colonial state, those who had maintained the integrity of their communities, such as in Mashpee, and they were forced to hire, at great expense relative to the time, white people to come in and run their town meetings, for example, and run their affairs as if they were incompetent to run their own self-governing councils, which they had kept for centuries. So I'm just trying to give you a little context here about how erroneous, really, this image here is. Let's go to the next slide. There were a series of royal governors, and each had their own seal for about a century. There were 12 of them, I think, after Governor Andros. And then at that point, the colonists had, had enough from their own point of view of the English crown meddling with their affairs and taking their money, and you know that whole story about the Boston Tea Party and such, and Lexington, Concord, and Bunker Hill. And so at that time, the revolutionary government kicked out the royal governor from Boston, and Governor John Hancock of the revolutionary American government in Boston reached out to Paul Revere and said, we need our own seal. We're not going to use one of these royal seals any longer. What are we going to do to indicate that our bills of lading and our invoices are actual real documents? We need our own stamp and seal because we need to requisition, arms and uniforms and boots and all that sort of thing. And also they wanted to, indicate that they were now declaring their hope for independence. So this is the Paul Revere seal, just showing you how over time it has changed. It's not like this has been a static image that has stayed the same for nearly 4 centuries. So this, for 5 years, was the seal of Massachusetts during the Revolutionary struggle. And there's the Magna Carta, where the principle of no taxation without representation was first enunciated, and held in the hand of a Minuteman bearing a sword. And a very Anglo-centric and perhaps very appropriate seal for the time and for the struggle that they were engaged in. And yet, just 5 years later, Governor Hancock, turned again to one of his governor's counselors, a man named Nathaniel Cushing, who knew a lot about heraldry and coats of arms from England, and said, okay, this symbol here, this was good for the revolutionary struggle, even though the war was still going on. He said, what are we going to do going forward? Because we're going to win this war, and we need something that we're going to live with from here on, the Massachusetts seal. And if we go to the next slide, for some reason, Cushing went back to the original central motif of a native person with one downward pointed arrow and no quiver, and now a sword is shown, in a very dominant position above the head of the native person. There's no more speech balloon coming out of his mouth. There's a star to indicate that Massachusetts is one of the original 13 colonies engaged in the struggle. And now there's a Latin phrase, which we're living with still today, that is translated, according to the Secretary of State's website anyway, as she seeks a quiet peace under the sword, but peace with liberty. And so, in some sense, Native people have looked at this. I know for 50 years there's been a real struggle and a protest, but I'm sure for a very long time, and said liberty is not something, quiet peace under the sword, for one thing, is not something that was in large evidence or available to Native people, but liberty was even less so. For example, it was illegal for Native people to walk into the city limits of Boston until Mayor Menino finally, in 2005, repealed that law. They were not at liberty to run their own governmental affairs. And many of them were still kept either as hopelessly indentured servants or as slaves. So this, from a Native perspective, even at this time, was terribly wrong. There's something terribly wrong about this image from their point of view, and I think it's fair to look at it that way. There is no written record that I've been able to find or that anybody else has been able to show me, and I've searched through the special collections room at the State House and at the State Archives as to why Nathaniel Cushing, who was pretty much a committee of one, again, the Revolutionary War was ongoing, it was not yet settled, that conflict, but why did he go back to this? I can find one reference of his towards Native people. He calls them, to paraphrase, or pretty carefully quote him, wild savages in the woods. It was not meant to honor Native people, I can tell you that much. And so this image was accepted by Governor Hancock and by the rest of the the revolutionary, you couldn't quite call it a legislature, but the governor's council. And it became, and it still is, these basic elements are seal and flag today. Let's see how artists have rendered it in various ways. If you'll move to the next slide, over the time period from 1780 until now. This to me is a particularly frightening image of a heavily armed sword above the head of the native person. And sometimes the bow would be held in the left hand, sometimes it would be held in the right hand. And to the next slide, finally in 1890, in 1885, but it took a little while, the Secretary of State at that time, his name was William Olin, and he said, enough of this artistic freedom. Which hand is the bow going to be held in, and which hand is the downward arrow? And let's have the native person always look exactly the same, and the proportions of the size of the sword over his head will be fixed and permanent. And so they actually codified this into law, and it has stayed just this way since 1895. Maybe see the next slide. William Olin hired an illustrator named Edmund Garrett, a very well-known illustrator at that time, to do the work of fixing this image, he thought, permanently. And it really has lasted nearly 140 years. But we're hoping that perhaps the legislature, in its wisdom, might consider changing it now for reasons which will become a little bit more apparent when you look at some of the elements themselves that Garrett worked with and worked into the seal and the flag that's based upon it. And we know about this from his own writing and his own words, because he published an account of his labors in creating this image in a general circulation magazine, which you can probably find, well, you certainly can find it in Google, but you might be able to actually find it in some of the stacks of the old libraries, called the New England Magazine. It was a general circulation publication, volume 23, 1901. He, in 1901, felt very comfortable with the readership at large opinion of Native people, and called them poor savages in that article. He said, not a direct quote, but to paraphrase, the people who know, he said, I don't know Native people very well, but the people who are his closest associates, who know him the best, like them the least. That was part of his article as well. But he came, was not at all ashamed to say that this is how he put this together. He said that he had used a skeleton of a native person from Winthrop to make sure that the bodily proportions were just so, as if native people have somehow different body types than the rest of us, and that they needed to disturb the bones of some native ancestor to make sure they had the bodily proportions right. The bow was taken from a native person who was shot and killed by a settler in Sudbury 10 years before the war that I mentioned, King Philip's War, or Metacom's War, in 1665. We know the name of the settler. His name was William Goodnough. We don't know the name of the native person whose bow we have been looking at ever since. This facial features of the seal and flag were taken from a Montana chief named Little Shell, a Chippewa chief, not from Massachusetts, but considered by Garrett and the white anthropologists who he relied upon as a, quote, fine specimen of an Indian. The belt, to the best of their belief, was the belt worn in battle by King Philip himself, a red flannel belt that's kept in the Peabody Museum in Boston, in Cambridge, in Harvard. That museum also is notorious for having more skeletal remains of Native people than almost any other museum in the country. And this is now 33 years after the passage of the federal Native American Graves Repatriation Act, and yet they're still holding on to thousands of skeletons as if they, can claim some legitimate scientific reason. Can you imagine if King Philip's War had gone the other way and Native people were studying our ancestors' skeletal remains and keeping them in locked cabinets in museums and universities across the land? And the most recent estimate from Deb Haaland, the first Native American Secretary of the Interior, is that there are now still over 100,000 skeletal remains kept in private hands of Native people around this country, and Harvard is one of the worst offenders there. Anyway, they felt like this was his belt. I can't say whether that's true or not, but they have it in their collection. And so that belt was patterned after a Metacom, the garment that he wore. We often hear, and it's a terrible phrase, of the savagery of Native people, these savages. Yet, you know, when Metacom was shot and killed in battle in Mount Hope, Rhode Island in the summer of 1676, the English drew and quartered his corpse, cut off his hands, sent one of his hands to the King of England, and mounted his head on a stake in Plymouth for more than 20 years. So savagery was not in short supply in those days on either side of the struggle. But I just want to mention that this was considered to be his belt, and William Olin, the Secretary of State, insisted that Edmund Garrett use the broadsword of Miles Standish, which is kept in the Pilgrim Hall in Plymouth as the model for the broadsword. And so the relationship between that sword, I mentioned Miles Standish's use of that sword only 2.5 years after the Pilgrims had arrived and been helped through that first terrible winter against Native people. And so from a Native perspective, to see, you know, that sword above a Native figure wearing the belt of King Philip is something that they look at as a very particularly pointed and egregious way of reminding them of the violence that they had endured and lived through. And it is considered that by people such as Jim Peters, who's the current director of the Massachusetts Commission on Indian Affairs, and who I have heard say in public hearings at the State House, this symbol is an accurate representation of our history. And so should we keep it, since it is an accurate representation of the violence of our past? This is taught as part of the core curriculum on the 3rd grade level in every public school, or it is supposed to be in the Commonwealth. And there are 90,000 at least, according to the last census, Native people who live here among us still, particularly here in Grafton. We know that. And they go to our public schools, of course, their children do. And I've been at hearings in Boston where Native mothers are in tears over this, saying it is hard for us to walk our children down the hall under this symbol, under this flag. May we see the next slide, please? And so here, for example, is Ferris Gray, the Sagamore of the Massachusetts tribe of Ponkapog, in the fall of 2019, standing in front of the State House saying, as many of his forebears had said for 50 years before, it's time to change the flag and seal. And I think in fairness to our history, to face our history, and in respect of the Native people of this land, I agree wholeheartedly that the time has come, the time has long since come to take down this symbol of past violence. For a long time we were in a struggle, we felt, with Mississippi to see who would hold on to a symbol, a flag of obvious violence between the races the longest. And Mississippi held on to, they were the last southern state to hold on to the Confederate stars and bars as their state flag, up until the terrible murder of George Floyd that was just referenced at the beginning of the meeting, when sports teams would no longer play at the conference bowls in Mississippi as long as that flag still flew. And for decades there had been a struggle there to get that flag changed. And Mississippi, it is the state with the largest African American population in the country, and finally they took it down. But that left Massachusetts as the last flag flying of this kind of violence between the races, let's just put it that way. And that is, to me, a terribly shameful thing. And I'm not alone in that feeling. I was the editor of a newspaper in the town of Montague, I'll try to wrap up quickly, for many years. And I couldn't help but comment on the fact that our sports teams were named the Indians at our high school, in a town where the high school was named after a man named Captain William Turner, who came and killed every Indian he could find on May 19th, 1676. So in the middle of the struggle to change, the successful struggle to change that mascot, I know you've done that here in Grafton, thank you. They're very emotional hearings, because although people do not have a deep love for the flag of Massachusetts, people have a deep love for the jersey that they wore in high school. And in my town, people painted their face blue and wore turkey feather headdresses and performed the tomahawk chop. And the native children who go to our district, 2 or 3 on average every year, as brave warriors, you know, when of course native children can be anything from kindergarten on up. They could be poets, they could be scientists, they don't all have to be native warriors. So we succeeded in persuading the school committee over huge, overwhelming protest to change that mascot with the aid of our superintendent. And in one of those emotional hearings, a man stood up in the back of the room and said, if we have to change our school mascot, why shouldn't the state have to change their mascot? And he was referring to the flag, and somebody opened it up on this auditorium stage of our high school, and I took a look at it and said to myself, this was quite a few years ago now, the man has a good point. And I've really been working on this ever since, and I'm just one of many. But I brought it to town meetings in my area. It's too late to get it on the warrant in Montague, where I'm from. But we took it to Gill, Wendell, New Salem, and the town of Orange, which had just voted in the majority for Donald Trump over Hillary Clinton shortly before. And we won all 4 of those town meeting votes to change the flag and seal. And I thought, well, that ought to do it. That ought to persuade the legislature, which for 34 years in a row had been stalling on a bill to set up a special commission, just a commission to study the seal on the flag the same way we've looked at the elements here tonight. They wouldn't even set up the commission until 4 towns was not enough, until we got 32 cities and towns to vote. And at that point, the legislature said, fine. And they invited 6 native leaders to sit with a bipartisan group of legislators, the Secretary of State's designee, historians, and others, on a special commission, which they were that commission was supposed to report back with their recommendations for a new flag and seal in October of 2021. The governor at that time, Governor Baker, hadn't even appointed them until November of that year. They didn't start meeting until January of last year, 2022. They were given no money to work with. It's sort of hard to convince artists to come up with artwork or to do public polling to see what people in Grafton might like to see for a new flag and seal, and every other city in town. So the commission came to a unanimous vote that the flag and seal is causing harm today and needs to be totally revised, and that was a huge effort on the part of the 6 indigenous leaders on the 19-member commission. It wasn't easy, but they got unanimous agreement from that statewide bipartisan group. And then they turned back to the legislature and said, we need some money to work with, and we need more time. And so in late November of last year, they got some money to work with, but the legislature forgot or somehow neglected to give them an extension on their deadline, which at that time was in December 31st, a few months ago. So they had the money and no time to spend it. And I talked to the co-chair of the commission, who happens to live in my neighborhood, Leverett, next town. He said it was almost as if they set the commission up to fail. About a month ago, the city of Newburyport became the 56th city or town to vote in favor of changing the flag and seal, and suddenly the new governor, Maura Healey, found space in the supplemental budget bill that passed just less than a month ago to include a little time extension on the special commission's deadline. And so now the commission has money to work with, and they have time until the middle of November of this year to do some public polling and to come up with what we hope will be a consensus with input from people around the Commonwealth of what a beautiful new flag could look like. When Mississippi consulted with Native people, they came up with this great magnolia flag, a tribute to the Biloxi tribe, to whom that image has special significance. Some of the ideas that have been mentioned here on the commission are, like natural elements that are particular to our Commonwealth, like the cranberry or the cod. There's also been talk about the highest point in the Commonwealth. Let's have the profile of Mount Greylock, named after a native leader who never was defeated in battle. Or the shape of Cape Cod itself. Many other good ideas, the chickadee, for example. Children in grade schools are coming up with great designs and forwarding them to the legislature. And so we can really look forward with a sort of sense of hope and positivity that this really could finally happen. And it is, I would say, the town meetings themselves and the city councils that have driven this process forward, if you look at how it's gone. And if Grafton were to join this growing list of towns, now 59, and actually West Newbury and Merrimack are voting tonight, it will have, I think, a very significant impact on your local legislators and on the whole process as a whole. So with that hopeful note, I'm going to thank you for listening to me. I went on longer than I thought I would, and there's still time, I think, for questions, and I hope you have some so that I can try to answer them. Thank you. Questions, comments? Yeah.
So,
Yes.
So at this point, yeah. So at this point, with the funding back in place,
Yep.
Is there anything else that needs to get done that our voice is working towards, other than just keeping the pressure on to make sure there's no more like the timeline right now, like not just to keep things on track?
I would say absolutely yes. That time will come. I think anybody could be writing to Governor Healy right now and saying, Governor Healy, your predecessor, the Republican governor, set this commission up, and it has Republicans and Democratic legislators as well as Indigenous people. The first time we've ever talked with Indigenous people about the use of their symbol, their imagery on our symbol in almost 400 years, so that's historic. And this bipartisan commission came to a consensus, even though they haven't presented you the new artwork yet, that we need to change this flag and seal. And Governor Tate down in Mississippi, when it came to the point of deciding what the new flag should look like down there, he took it down for 3 months and told the legislature, for 3 months they had no flag, and he told the legislature to get busy and come up with something better. Maura Healy could do that, and we should all, I think, put a little bit of pressure on her to, if this symbol is causing harm, and if Native kids in the schools are having to study this, and every child, no matter what color of their skin, is looking at this symbol. Can we go back and just take a look at it again? Yeah, this is a harmful symbol, and let her be on notice that she can do this too. She can take this down. That's her prerogative, authority. There's one thing you can do. You can talk to your legislators in advance of the town meeting and let them know that if this passes, they're going to be receiving a document from the town clerk of Grafton, letting them know that this is now the priority of the town of Grafton. What else could you do? The time will come, and it will come within a year, I think, that there will be a hearing in Boston. And now, given the fact that we just went through the pandemic, they're allowing these hearings to take place, and we're probably still going through the pandemic. They're allowing them to take place by Zoom, so you don't have to travel all the way to the State House to testify. And anyone can testify to this, to say, this should be changed, and we want you to do it. And when that day comes, so take a leaflet on your way out, everybody. This is the website that I have put together, and hundreds of people follow it, 1,000 perhaps. And when the day comes and the hearing is held, I'll let everybody know. If you just write to me, give me your email or whatever, I'll stay in touch with you. So those are all some different ways that individuals can, talk to the governor, talk to your legislators, be prepared to say a few words when that hearing comes up. This is the first time in 140 years that the Commonwealth has seriously reviewed the flag and seal. It's a historic process. Every town has as part of state law, every town has to fly the flag, both in the public buildings and in the public schools. So it touches us all, and it's actually everywhere when you begin to look at it critically. It comes to you as on the front page of the voter guide come election time. It's on the bridge abutments, on every bridge. And it is, flying from the state police barracks. It is, when you drive into town on any state highway, it'll say, entering Grafton, and right in the middle there's a sign holding a sword over a native person's head. When you go to the last 4 acres that are held by the Hassanamasco Nipmuc here in Grafton, I forget the name of the road, but it's very close to here. There's a big historic sign right in front of their reservation with a native person with a sword over his head. And Brittany Wally, who's the Nipmuc representative to the Special Commission, she's on that commission. She and I and another Indigenous woman from the commission were just a group, what is it called these days? Zoom meeting, podcast, I'm not sure what you call it, with the Partnership for Historic Boston's big group. And Brittany said, I'm just about to graduate from one of the state colleges, and I'm going to receive my diploma after 4 years of very hard work, and there's going to be a sword over the head of a native person, and I'm supposed to hang that on my wall in honor of my graduation. So, we should protest this, all of us, and there are ways to do it. Other comments, questions?
I'm sorry, I just got but are there a collective cities and towns similar to Grafton who are trying the same?
I'm so sorry, I'm a little hard of hearing.
No,
Can you
that's all right.
can you repeat this
in
question?
order for it to be on the recording, we need
Can you-
it on the mic. Yeah.
Or say that one more time.
Are there other cities and towns who
Have it on the warrant?
are also on board with the
Yes.
idea?
Yes.
And has anyone ever reached out to do a collective hearing from these members of the cities and towns to try to give them more?
So I'll tell you that there are now 59 cities and towns that have voted in favor of changing the flag and seal, including, I'm trying to think of the ones closest to us here, Bolton, Lunenburg, Sturbridge, all those towns have already said yes, many, many others. And tonight, as I was mentioning before you walked in, the towns of West Newbury and Merrimack are voting. Last week, Falmouth, very close vote, 98 to 94, but it passed, okay. In Irving, it passed really near my town, it passed by 1 vote. But, we'll take a victory when we get it, even by 1 vote. I'm just trying to emphasize that it could be very close here in Grafton, and if each of you free that night, don't think that your vote or your voice would be wasted to show up and support what Native people are calling upon us to do. But yes, there are 24 more cities and towns about to vote in the next couple of weeks. When will we have reached a number that is sufficient to push the legislature forward? I mean, there are 351 cities and towns. Do we have to get every single one of them to say, take this flag down? No, I don't think so. I think we're getting close. And if Grafton were to join that list and become the 60th town, let's just say, maybe it'll be the 70th by that time, 2 weeks from now. It will not be an idle gesture. I mean, that resolution, the town clerk will be asked to send that to your legislators and to the Joint Committee on State Administration, where they're going to make this decision soon.